The sound of a police badge hitting the pavement should have been nothing more than a dull thud, but in Nairobi it echoed like a gunshot across a nation. A tall officer stood in the middle of a busy intersection, removed his cap, unpinned his badge, and whispered for all to hear, "I cannot serve a system that crushes its own." In that moment, Kenya froze. Traffic stopped, phones came out, and within minutes the scene went viral. The question on everyone's lips wasn't about the man's name. It was about the system he had just walked away from. Thousands of miles away in the dusty village of Kaya, Burkina Faso, a very different image unfolded. President Ibrahim Traoré, wearing a simple cotton robe and worn shoes, bent his shoulders to help villagers lift wooden beams for a new school. No podium, no bodyguards, no foreign money, just hands, sweat, and trust. One country's guardians of order were laying down their symbols of power, while another country's leader was laying foundations for classrooms. This contrast shook Africa. How could Kenya, with its larger GDP, international support, and IMF-backed loans, find itself collapsing under the weight of distrust, while Burkina Faso, one of the poorest nations on paper, was rising through sheer belief and participation? The answer isn't about money. It's about leadership. It's about presence. And it's about whether people still believe their sacrifices mean anything. So tonight we're asking what truly holds a nation together. Is it numbers and loans from distant boardrooms, or the quiet trust built between leaders and their people? The story of Kenya and Burkina Faso may reveal not just a tale of two countries, but a choice that Africa and perhaps the world must confront. Stay with us, because what you are about to hear might change the way you see education, leadership, and Africa itself. And while you're here, let us know in the comments, where in the world are you tuning in from? If stories like this matter to you, give this video a like, share it, and subscribe so that more voices can be heard. Nairobi at noon is rarely silent. The city hums with honking Matatus motorcycles weaving through traffic and pedestrians negotiating for shade under the blazing sun. But on that day, something extraordinary happened. A single officer, uniformed and tall, walked into the center of the intersection. Instead of directing traffic, he stopped it. With steady, deliberate movements, he removed his cap. Then, with fingers that trembled just slightly, he unclipped his badge. The small piece of metal glinted in the light for a brief second before falling soundlessly to the asphalt. No gunfire, no tear gas, just silence. Yet it was the kind of silence that could shake a country. People froze in disbelief. A few clapped instinctively. Then the phones came out. Within minutes, videos of the act spread across Kenya, across Africa, and then the world. And with every replay, the same sentence rang out, etched into memory: "I cannot serve a system that crushes its own." The badge became more than a discarded emblem. It became a symbol of rupture, an unspoken declaration that even those sworn to enforce order had reached their breaking point. Soon after, resignations rippled through the ranks. Officers in Kisumu, Eldoret, and Mombasa posted images of boots left at station doors. Some quietly dropped their batons on dusty desks. Others, braver, still recorded short videos of defiance. "We are human too. We serve the people, not the debt." The spark had been lit, and it spread like dry fire in a parched savanna. Students who had been marching for tuition relief saw their chants echoed by the very forces once sent to contain them. Nurses leaving hospital shifts held placards alongside retired soldiers. Teachers who hadn't been paid in months nodded as they saw officers formerly feared walking beside them in solidarity. The government scrambled, statements were issued, press conferences tried to downplay the phenomenon as misunderstandings, but no one bought it. The images were too powerful, too undeniable. Kenya was witnessing something deeper than rebellion. It was witnessing a moral collapse of loyalty. Meanwhile, thousands of miles away in Burkina Faso, another kind of silence carried a different weight. In the village of Kaya, a group of youth volunteers hammered nails into wooden beams. Children scurried about carrying buckets of water, while elders handed down scraps of wood and tools. And there among them stood President Ibrahim Traoré. No suit, no entourage, no armored cars. Just a simple robe dust on his shoes and a steady hand helping to lift the wooden frame of a school wall. There were no speeches, no staged photographs, only presence. The president of a nation bent under the same sun as his people, doing the same work. To outside observers, it looked small, one unfinished school in a poor landlocked country. But to Burkina citizens, it was monumental. Here was leadership not asking for sacrifice from afar, but sharing in it up close. As Kenya's police laid down badges, Burkina Faso's youth picked up hammers. One nation unraveling in betrayal, another piecing itself together in faith. The contrast could not have been sharper. And for millions of Africans scrolling through their phones comparing both videos side by side, a new question began to take root. Which model of power should define Africa's future? The breaking point did not come suddenly. It had been building for months, hidden in late paychecks, shrinking food baskets, and whispered complaints inside police barracks. But when the elite paramilitary unit, the General Service Unit GSU, marched not against civilians but alongside them, the nation realized the center could no longer hold. These were the officers once regarded as untouchable, feared enforcers of state power. Now they removed helmets, tore insignias from their uniforms, and stood in formation not against, but with the people. One voice from the ranks shouted, "Enough is enough," and the cry rolled through the crowd like thunder. Social media exploded. Within hours, the hashtag Mars Sons of the System trended across Kenya. Videos of uniformed men placing their gear on the ground flooded TikTok and Facebook. One clip of an officer saluting student protesters before walking away reached millions in less than a day. Suddenly, what had begun as isolated resignations had become a national chorus of defiance. It wasn't chaos, it was clarity. The message was unmistakable. Even those paid to enforce the government's austerity-driven order no longer believed in it. The government's response was frantic. Spokespeople dismissed the resignations as staged. State media suggested infiltration by agitators. But the more they denied, the more people believed the opposite. Because it wasn't just students in the streets, it was nurses, bank tellers, shopkeepers, even clerics, all pointing to the same wound, a system that placed IMF debt repayments above human dignity. President William Ruto appeared on television urging calm. "Don't burn your country." He pleaded, his voice trembling slightly. Yet his words, far from reassuring, only highlighted the fragility of his authority. What burns a country faster than broken trust? And then came Jonas Wesa. A police officer with 7 years of quiet service, Wesa posted a shaky video from the passenger seat of an old Toyota. No slogans, no theatrics, just weary eyes and a steady voice. "We are sons of this system, but sons are not slaves. We have the right to say enough." Within 12 hours, his video had crossed 5 million views. Civil society groups reposted it, students projected it on campus walls, and even health worker unions echoed his words in official statements. It was not rebellion. It was revelation. Across Africa, the contrast grew sharper. At the same moment Kenya's forces were disowning the system, images from Burkina Faso showed President Ibrahim Traoré refusing IMF loans worth billions. He didn't hide the reasons in technical jargon. Standing on a cracked platform in Kaya, he explained plainly to villagers, "These loans would cut teachers, cut nurses, and make us dependent. Our soil is not poor, it is ignored." Western think tanks called his rejection reckless. Credit rating agencies downgraded Burkina Faso's outlook from stable to negative. Headlines screamed instability rising. But on the ground, the people saw something else. In makeshift classrooms under baobab trees, students continued their lessons, sometimes using bottle caps for math or chalk scrawled onto wooden doors. Farmers repaired abandoned tractors with scrap parts. Mothers volunteered to feed children during evening study sessions. It wasn't glamorous, but it was theirs. In Bobo Dioulasso, a teenager summed it up in a single line shared thousands of times online. "They can downgrade our credit, but they cannot downgrade our spirit." Meanwhile, in Kenya, anger deepened. University students confronted their professors. "If Burkina Faso can say no, why can't we?" Teachers in Mombasa asked their unions why they had accepted wage cuts without protest. The IMF contract that had once seemed like a distant policy paper was suddenly exposed as a national betrayal. Each clause translated into a cut program, a delayed paycheck, a shuttered clinic. For ordinary citizens, the numbers had faces now, the face of a hungry child, a dismissed nurse, a police officer too ashamed to return home without pay. The climax of these parallel stories was stark. In one country, authority fractured from within. In another, authority fused with the people. Kenya's institutions unraveled as those sworn to uphold them abandoned their posts. Burkina Faso's institutions, though fragile, began to grow roots in trust, in participation, in sacrifice freely chosen. And across the continent, a banner seemed to rise in the digital ether. What does real leadership look like? The shockwaves of Kenya's police rebellion rippled far beyond the barracks, when authority itself began to fracture. The consequences for civil society were immediate and unavoidable. Classrooms emptied as teachers refused to work without pay. In rural counties, hospital wards turned away patients not for lack of will, but for lack of supplies. Parents pulled children from schools they could no longer afford. A loaf of bread cost twice what it had just a year earlier. Long fuel lines stretched for blocks with mothers rocking babies on car hoods, while police vans queued behind them equally helpless. These were not just signs of poverty, they were signs of a system collapsing under the weight of broken trust. For decades, Kenyans had endured hardship caused by droughts, corruption, and regional conflicts. But this was different. This was hardship created by deliberate choices, by contracts signed in quiet offices with foreign creditors, forcing cuts in the very services that held society together. The rebellion of officers and teachers wasn't a call for chaos. It was a cry against betrayal. Politically, the cracks grew wider. President Ruto's government, once projecting strength through international alliances and IMF approval, now looked cornered at home. Each attempt to reassure citizens rang hollow, met with mocking hashtags and protests in university halls. Opposition leaders capitalized on the discontent, framing the crisis as proof that Kenya's sovereignty had been sold to foreign lenders. Even within ruling party ranks, whispers of discontent surfaced, parliamentarians questioning whether loyalty to the president was worth losing the loyalty of their constituents. The political stage that once seemed stable was now a chessboard of defections and uncertainty. And yet, even as Kenya struggled to hold itself together, Burkina Faso was quietly writing a different chapter. In villages like Kayadugu and Toma, citizens stepped into gaps the state could not fill. Retired teachers returned to classrooms unpaid but determined. Farmers taught soil conservation techniques to university students eager for practical knowledge. Women organized communal kitchens to feed workers rebuilding schools. What emerged was not anarchy, but ownership, a society no longer waiting for salvation, but building it with their own hands. The political consequence in Burkina Faso was equally profound. Far from being weakened by his rejection of IMF loans, President Ibrahim Traoré's credibility deepened. Western analysts predicted instability, but on the ground, trust grew stronger. His government became less about decrees and more about presence. Each visit to a rural community, each day he worked alongside ordinary citizens, reinforced the message, the state is not above you, it is with you. That subtle shift turned fragile institutions into living bonds. Across Africa, the contrast became a lesson. Kenya showed what happens when foreign-imposed austerity tears at the social fabric, when institutions once feared begin to crumble under the same pressures as ordinary citizens. Burkina Faso showed what happens when leadership refuses those terms even at the cost of international scorn and instead invests trust in its people. The civil consequences were visible in schools and clinics. The political consequences were written in loyalty or in its absence. And so two parallel truths emerged. In Kenya, political legitimacy evaporated as quickly as salaries. In Burkina Faso, legitimacy multiplied in the dust of village courtyards and half-built classrooms. One nation discovered that money without trust leads to collapse. The other discovered that trust without money can still build. From Washington to Brussels, the images coming out of Africa told two very different stories, yet both unsettled policymakers. In Kenya, the sight of uniformed police abandoning their posts, saluting student protesters, and declaring loyalty to the people, not the debt, raised alarms in Western capitals. Stability, long the watchword of U.S. and European engagement with East Africa, suddenly looked fragile. For Washington, Kenya is a critical ally, a hub for counterterrorism operations, regional diplomacy, and economic corridors. The idea that Kenya's security forces, the backbone of its cooperation with the West, might no longer obey the state shook confidence in Nairobi's reliability. But the other story, the quieter one from Burkina Faso, unsettled them even more. President Ibrahim Traoré's outright rejection of IMF loans was not just a domestic choice. It was a symbolic act of defiance against the very architecture of global finance that Washington, Paris, and Brussels had helped build. By refusing billions in aid, Traoré questioned the central premise of Western-backed development, that progress in Africa depends on outside credit conditionality and oversight. His message that dignity and participation mattered more than donor approval resonated not only in his own villages but across the continent. American analysts worried about the precedent. If Burkina Faso, a poor landlocked country, could survive without IMF lifelines, what would stop Ghana, Nigeria, or even Kenya from demanding similar autonomy? The U.S. State Department urged caution, framing Traore's policies as risky and potentially destabilizing. European credit agencies downgraded Burkina Faso almost immediately, hoping to pressure the government back into responsible financial behavior. Western media headlines painted a grim picture: Burkina Faso on the brink, rising instability after aid rejection. And yet these warnings seemed disconnected from the reality on the ground. While Western commentators spoke of collapse, videos circulated across Africa showing Burkinabe youth teaching in open-air classrooms, farmers repairing tractors with scrap metal, and women's cooperatives feeding school children. African audiences did not see instability, they saw resilience. They saw proof that leadership grounded in trust rather than foreign directives could actually inspire action. In the U.S., the Kenyan crisis hit another nerve. Many older Americans watching the footage were reminded of their own struggles with institutional trust. The image of police officers discarding badges in Nairobi resonated with Americans who had lived through Vietnam-era protests, Watergate, or more recent crises of confidence in government. They understood, perhaps more than policymakers realized, that once trust between people and institutions collapses, no amount of money can patch it back together. For African diaspora communities in the U.S. and Europe, the contrast between Kenya and Burkina Faso became a rallying point. Community leaders asked pointed questions. Why must Africa always be told that loans are the only path forward? Why are African governments praised in Washington only when they follow instructions, even if those instructions impoverish their citizens? And why is a leader like Traore, who works side by side with his people, framed as reckless, while leaders who sign away sovereignty are described as responsible? This divergence in perception reveals the deeper global stakes. For the West, the collapse of IMF credibility in Africa would be a geopolitical shock. It would weaken levers of influence carefully built over decades. For Africans, however, it would be liberation, the beginning of a future where dignity is not mortgaged for loans, where leadership is measured not in spreadsheets, but in shared sacrifice. And so the world watches uneasily. The U.S. hopes Kenya's unrest can be contained before security cooperation is jeopardized. Europe hopes Burkina Faso's defiance fails, proving once again that the system cannot be challenged. But for millions of Africans, the lesson is already clear. Stability that crushes its people is not stability. Instability that awakens participation may be the foundation of a new order. The question now is not only African, it is universal. When institutions fail, will leaders double down on control or step down into the dust to build trust? In the end, the contrast could not be sharper. In Kenya, the image burned into memory is that of a police badge lying abandoned on hot asphalt, a symbol of loyalty finally broken. In Burkina Faso, the enduring image is a chalkboard nailed to a cracked wall where children write their names with borrowed pieces of chalk, a symbol of belief reborn. Both moments carry weight, but only one points to a future. The warning is clear. A nation can survive poverty, drought, even war. What it cannot survive is the collapse of trust between its people and its leaders. Kenya shows us how quickly that trust can unravel when governments place foreign creditors above their own citizens. Burkina Faso shows us how quickly it can grow when leaders, even with empty coffers, choose presence over promises and dignity over debt. This is not just Africa's debate, it is a global one. Across the world, societies are asking the same question: what really holds a country together? Is it the contracts signed in distant boardrooms or the conversations held in dusty courtyards? Is it measured in GDP growth rates or in whether a child still believes her future belongs to her? These questions resonate not only in Nairobi and Ouagadougou, but in Detroit, in Naples, in Sao Paulo, wherever ordinary people feel the gap widening between themselves and the institutions meant to serve them. And so the story of Ibrahim Traoré and Burkina Faso is more than local news. It is a mirror reflecting what leadership can look like when it begins not from money, but from meaning. It is a reminder that power is not always loud. Sometimes it is as quiet as a man kneeling to listen to a child's dream for a school that will not collapse when it rains. But the mirror also reflects a warning. If nations continue down the path of dependency, ignoring the voices of their own people, they risk repeating Kenya's crisis, where not only the governed, but even the guardians of order walk away. So we leave you with a question. Do you think President Ibrahim Traoré's model of rejecting aid and building from within is sustainable for Africa, or is it too risky to trust? Can Africa continue to rise on faith, or must it bend once more to foreign terms? We want to hear from you. Please share if you feel you are one of the first to know about and support President Ibrahim Traoré. Subscribe if you believe that truth is more important than headlines. And in the comments, tell us, what do you think truly holds a nation together, money or trust? Because in the end, Africa's future and perhaps the world's may depend on how we answer that question.